Okay, so the first thing I wanted to touch on in Photoshop is the type tool, and mainly because we're going to be looking at it in a week or two's time, but also because you might want to produce some signage or type or use type as a kind of graphic within your project. So we can use it just like we can any other element that we're drawing with. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab a new document here, just a standard letter document, and we're just going to run through the basic type tool, so how we change the size, how we work with the leading, how we change the font and that kind of thing. So, and I'll ask this question at the moment. So if I say leading and kerning and tracking, hands up who's heard those terms before. Okay, a little bit. Okay, that's fine. They're kind of technical terms for type, but you'll have heard about them in a second. So basically, what we're looking at now when we start to think about type, digital type, is how we kind of work with it, how we space it, and eventually how we kind of design nicely with it. So we're looking for control over all different aspects of that that type. Okay, so let's just save this as type intro. So the type tool in Photoshop is basically a vector tool as well. So when we make type in Photoshop, it's not like a pixelated bitmap image. It's a vector like the stars and stuff we were drawing in the first lab, and so you can scale it to any size. Okay, so if we pull out a text box here, we can type in, oops, so I'm typing in there but nothing's happening, and there's a reason for that, and that is that I've got my type set to a massive point size because I was working on something else earlier. So I'm just going to drop that down, and I'm also just going to come in here and reset some of these settings that we're going to be covering in a bit. Okay, so with our type in Photoshop, first thing we do is make a type box. Okay, so drag out a type box, and then our options toolbar up here kind of comes to life. So we have all the different options for the different fonts that we can choose, that we can work with within Photoshop. Now the way that I like to kind of spec out the fonts that I'm using, and I'll just push the size of, whoa, don't do that. The way that I like to spec out the size of the fonts that I'm using is to make the type box, jump back to the selection tool, and then jump back to the type tool. And what that allows me to do is to go and scroll through all the different typefaces that I have just by placing the cursor in here, and I can just use the downward cursor to start kind of moving through all those different fonts. So whatever you've typed in, that's the nicest way to see the font in your design. So if we added a color to that, then we can see straight away what it's going to look like, and we can change the font. Okay, and one thing you'll notice about the font as well is that they don't work the same way that they do in applications like Microsoft Word. We have a lot of different options for the font. So if I change this to, let's go for Frutiger, you can see under Frutiger here I've got all these different cuts of the font. So I've got Frutiger Light Standard 47, Light Condensed, and if I just select that one, you can see we've got lots and lots of different cuts of that same font that are almost the same. Okay, so that's the sign of a good font, is that it has all these different cuts in there. So basically we can select any one of these and use them for different purposes within our design, but they'll match the look and feel of it. Okay, whereas in something like Microsoft Word, you'd have bold, italic, underlined, and that might be it. Okay, you don't always get all the different cuts of the font shown to you in some of those kind of basic applications, but we do in here. So if we go for something like Garamond, you can see we've got less options. So different fonts will have different sets of options when we're working in Photoshop. Okay, so we can change the font here, and we can change the way the font is orientated. So here, whether it's typing to the right or downwards, okay, and we can change the orientation here as well. We'll keep it at the standard for the moment just to keep things simple. And then also we've got other options here for the font size, which we already looked at, so we can change the font size. Okay, and then we've got some other options across here for the sharpness of the font, and the main reason that you would use these, the sharp, crisp, strong and smooth, is for different kinds of screen resolution. Okay, so for different uses for the fonts, you might go for crisp, which is going to change the anti-aliasing of the font around the edge. So the anti-aliasing, if we zoom in, when we're working on a Photoshop file, is this little bit of blur, and you get it around all the vector images that you create in Photoshop. Okay, so eventually when you print something out from Photoshop, whatever size you've made it, it still renders out a bitmap image, unlike Illustrator. Okay, so basically here we have a little bit of blurring around the edge, which is what makes that font look round at the edge. Okay, so this is anti-aliasing that you'll see here, and you see it if you drew a circle as well. Okay, if we make this none here, you'll see it just becomes a really hard edge, and that will print out really badly. You'll see all those kind of blocky edges. But if you're looking for kind of like a, I don't know, like old school Nintendo Game Boy like look and feel with hard edges, then you might want no anti-aliasing. And it's also useful for some very, very small web fonts. Okay, but I think that was a bigger thing like about 10 years ago when screen sizes were smaller. People would want to set their font sizes very small so they could fit more stuff on the screen because there wasn't much space on the screen. And so for some of the smaller web fonts, like when you're setting something at we're at 85 points here, but if you're setting something at 8 point or 7 point, then you'd have to use a very specific font that would work with no anti-aliasing, so kind of very blocky font like Verdana or something like that. Okay, so we'll normally leave it on crisp or sharp, and you can see it's just slightly changing the way that it's rendering that out. Okay, alrighty. So we've got our alignment tools here, so we can align things within the box that we've made. So for instance, if we want to get something to align dead center on a page, we'd make the box the same width as that page, so you can see it's snapping to the edge there when I'm stretching it out, and then we'd get that box to kind of snap the type to the middle there. Okay, so let's just move this guy up. I'm going to grab some type from the internet. So one thing that you get in typesetting applications like InDesign is you get this thing called lorem ipsum, which is like a fake Latin placeholder text. So I'm just going to grab some of that from the web for now, and there's some cool ones as well. You can get like a Reservoir Dogs or a Pulp Fiction lorem ipsum type, and there's some different kinds of, basically the standard one that most people use is this kind of fake Latin type. So we can generate it here. So I'll just generate 5 paragraphs of lorem ipsum, and I'm going to uncheck that, and it will generate this text that we can use. So the reason I'm grabbing this is just because I want to look at another layer of type that's going to be like a body layer of type. So I'm going to hide this layer, grab my type tool again, and I'll just set this to 11 point and Helvetica. Okay, I'll just drag this out. So now we have Helvetica in there. It's set as all caps, and the reason for that is that if I come across to the right hand side here, I've got more type options, and I have an option here for all caps which I used earlier. So it's a way of quickly setting your titles. Okay, so I'm just going to align this to the left, and we'll have a look at some of the basic type controls, and I'm going to turn this back to black. So so we can set type in Photoshop, and Photoshop's not really a place where you'd want to set kind of huge areas of type, and it's one of the big differences between something like Adobe Illustrator, Adobe InDesign and Photoshop. Okay, so one of the fundamental differences between Photoshop and InDesign and Illustrator is that in Illustrator and Photoshop you're normally working on a single document. Okay, so a single design in that document, whereas in InDesign you're always working on a multi-page document, so a document that has where the output would be a book or a magazine or something like that. Okay, so InDesign or Publisher are designed to make those books or magazines, and that's really one of the fundamental differences. And what that means is that when we're working with type in InDesign, we can flow it from page to page, which we can't do in Photoshop. Okay, so here if we wanted to make a magazine in Photoshop, we'd have to make it almost a different document for each page of that magazine that we wanted to make, which you wouldn't want to do. It would be painful and slow. So InDesign would be the application to go for when you're doing that. But we still have these typesetting tools that we can use if we're mocking up a website or if we're setting up a single page poster. Okay, so you will come across these tools at some point. And they work essentially the same as most other type editors once we get into this. So they have the same controls that you have in InDesign and Illustrator. So if I drag across here, I'm just going to delete some of these paragraphs, I don't need them all. Okay, then with the paragraphs selected here, we can still change the font size in here using this slider, or we can type in a certain font size that we want to use, a point size. Okay, we can change the leading. So this is the first one of the terms I asked if you recognized, and basically the leading is the line spacing. So you can see as I'm increasing the line spacing or the leading, it's adding more space between the letters, between the lines of the type. Okay, so essentially if we just jump back like this, then we've got fancy kind of coffee table magazine with lots of space between the type, or we've got newspaper article which is really tightly set so you can get as much information on that page as possible. Okay, so if you're designing your type and you want to make it look nice, then you'll probably give yourself more space in the leading to try and make it easier for the reader's eye to kind of follow that information, whether it's for a poster or whatever. Okay, so and then we've got some other options here as well. We've got tracking just to the right here. So the tracking allows us to change the spacing between the words and the letters. Okay, so you can see as I'm doing that, it's kind of giving this very spaced out look. Okay, because I've dragged it to 1080 when it's normally set at 0. Okay, and then I've got options for my this is tracking and this is kerning. So kerning on the left hand side here is the space between an individual letter. So if I come here between, say, the S and the U that we can see here, just come down here. Okay, then I can change the space between that individual letter. So you can see as I'm pushing that space up, it's just tweaking the space between that one letter and the previous letter. Okay, so sometimes when you're setting a load of type, the flow of the type and the font face won't look quite right, so you want to get into the detail of it to kind of make it flow really nicely if you're wanting to set type. And a lot of that you wouldn't do in Photoshop, but the tools are still there. Then if we come down to here, we've got some type stretching tools which will do horrible things to our type. So we can stretch our font like that and like that, okay, which is going to make it look awful. So somebody spent a lot of time designing this font face. We don't want to destroy it, so we'd normally try to avoid using these stretching tools unless we had a really good reason to do it. Okay, then if we come down to the next section of options here, okay, I'm just going to type in a couple things here. So okay, so if we've got some type here but we need to use superscript or subscript, so the 6th here, then these options are in our character options here. So the superscript makes the T and the H pop up, and the subscript makes the 2 pop down if we're writing things where we need to kind of tweak those things. Okay. And then we've got some options here for fake bold and fake italic, which try not to use, and that kind of stuff. We've also got options down here as well, which are useful if you're spell checking stuff in different languages, which is the paragraph of type here can be spell checked in any of the languages that are listed here. So if we choose English Canadian, it's going to spell check it in English Canadian rather than English UK or English USA, or in French if we wanted to do something in French. Okay, and you can download other language packs if you've got different languages you need to use. So, any questions about typeface, typesetting? I'm going to get onto some cooler stuff now. Okay, we've looked at the basics, how you move stuff around and space it out. So let's have a look at how we play around with this type in a bit more of an interesting way. So the basics of the type, kind of being able to space it out and change the color of it, are going to give you your body type. But it's when you can use Photoshop's tools to do some different things with the type that it starts to get a bit more interesting. Okay, so I'm going to hide this layer, okay, and go back to my Thursday layer, and I'm just going to drag this up a bit bigger. Okay, and we'll make this in fact I want a really heavy bold here. So we've got different kinds of bold. So we've got heavy condensed bold, and then black is like a extra bold font. Okay, so this is Helvetica, but it almost looks like that impact font that you're probably familiar with. Okay, alright, so what I want to look at now is like a basic technique of how we get something inside that text. Okay, so we're going to grab a texture. So this rusty texture. Okay, open this up, grab my move tool here, and then just drag this across to this layer here. Okay, so once I've got my type above that layer, we can all probably guess how to do this. We can right click on the layer above, the rusty layer, and create a clipping mask, and it's going to put that type, that texture into that type. Okay, so now because this is on the layer above, with the move tool I can kind of reframe it and try and find the point at which this is working the best. Okay, so I can always change and move that around, and you can see the red of the type is still there. So if I wanted to still have some red in there, I could mix that in as well. So if I go to my texture layer, I can add a layer mask, grab the brush tool, okay, and we'll increase the size of this a little bit. Just push this up. In fact, just use the square brackets, soften that up a bit, and then we can paint in the layer below. Okay, so we can quickly kind of blend in those different things. Okay, we can also do some other neat things by mixing the fact that we've got this texture in the background. I'm just going to move this. In fact, I'm going to delete this clipping mask for the moment. Okay, I'm just going to move this down. Okay, so I want to hold down my Option key, my Alt key on the keyboard, and drag this below the words, so we get that texture in there behind. Okay, so what we can do now is on the word Thursday, and we haven't looked at these effects yet, I don't think. Oh no, we did. We added a drop shadow in the first week. So if we go to our effects here, we can add in a drop shadow. Okay, and you can see it's starting to poke out from behind there. So and we can move the drop shadow around by just dragging outside of that box to position it where we want it. So I'm going to increase the spread of that and just modify the size. Okay, and then we can just reposition that. So you can see we've got the words just kind of poking out from the background a little bit. Okay, so as you're working with layers, you can start to think about some creative ways in which you can combine the different techniques that we've been using. The other tool that we've used a little bit, I think, is the hue saturation adjustment layer. So if we grab that and turn on colorize here, then we can have some more fun with the kind of colorized layer in the background. Okay, so this hue can be changed to contrast with the foreground layer, and we can also adjust the brightness, so we still get that texture in the background that's in the type, but we get it to kind of pop out in an interesting way. Okay, actually the contrast there isn't that fantastic, so if we, there we go. Okay, now the nice thing about this is that we can always edit that type, so we can grab the type tool here and drag across it and edit it, or we can double click on here and select the type and edit it there as well. Okay, so we can type in anything we want. Alright, any questions about what I've just kind of run through there? This one, yeah, it's a photo I took, but I can share it with everyone. But it's just if I see a good looking wall, I'll take a picture of it, because that's the kind of thing you need from time to time in a design. So I have a little collection of like textures and stuff. So one of the things you can do as well as you're going around is kind of look for textures that aren't necessarily the cityscape that you want, but they could become useful as part of your design, part of your drawing. Okay, so for instance, I think I've got another image in here, so a tower image, but we might take an image like that and think this kind of broken apart rusty texture would look nice inside the tower. So if we take something like that and pull it onto the tower, oops, I didn't pull it right, then we can play around with things like the blend mode to kind of blend it onto the background. Okay, or we can do it more accurately with the clipping mask, and you can see how it's blending into different parts of that image with, you know, depending on what kind of blend mode we use. Okay, so yeah, so when you're photographing things or like looking for material for your projects, don't just think that you need the picture of the thing. Try and look close up, and because you can, in Photoshop, you can change the scale, make small things big and big things small. You can have some fun with that as well. Okay, alright, any other questions about playing with type and that kind of stuff? No? There's one other thing I was going to mention here as well, which is, if we turn, actually, so when I've made a few layers and I've got something that I like, I'll often group those into their own layer group. Okay, so I'm holding down Shift on layer 1 here, and then clicking my background layer, so it's everything apart from this top type layer. Okay, and I'm going to come up here and go to new group from layers, which is going to pull all those layers that I had selected into that one layer. Okay, so it's a layer organizational technique that we can use. Alright, so I can hide that, and I wanted to show you something else. So if we grab all this type and increase the size of it, then this might be something else you've seen as well, which is this kind of magazine style effect that pops up from time to time in skate magazines, surf magazines, that kind of thing. Okay, where you kind of get the type to overlay over itself, and the way that you do that is basically by setting the typeface larger than the leading. So the leading is smaller than the typeface, so it means the type will lay over itself. Okay, once you get type like that, it also almost starts to make a texture as well, so you can start to play around with that in your designs too. Okay, so any questions about type? I'm going to pause the recording so these things are slightly organized.